I've been asked to speak about Part 10 of the Jesuit Constitutions, which is the last part. There's 10 parts to the text. It is the shortest part, and I would argue that it is probably the most misunderstood part. All right. Now, what I would like to do is explain, first of all, what the Part 10 says, and then why it's misunderstood very often. Okay. So, to begin, there is a tension that runs throughout the entire history of Christian spirituality about to what degree should we rely simply on God, trust in God's providence to get something done, and to what extent should we do human works, engage in human activities and means to get a job done. So, to use a simple example, as you know, there are many Christians who say that it is a sign of a lack of faith to go to a doctor. If their child is sick, they will pray that God heals their child, but will not take their child to the doctor because they perceive that as a lack of faith. Right? Now, I presume everyone here would say, well, yes, of course, trust God, pray to God, but also take your child to the doctor. Okay? Their response would be, well, going to the doctor is anything that any human being would do. That's just a human way of thinking, of proceeding. That's a human means to get something done. We ought to be authentic witnesses by doing something different. And the other response would be, well, yes, we are called to be signs of trust in God, but God also wants us to work with creatures like doctors. God created doctors, and so when we work with doctors and rely on their wisdom and skill, we are also giving glory to God. So do you understand the distinction there, the tension, right? And this manifests itself in many ways. A friend of mine is a professional fundraiser for Catholic schools. And he told me the story that he was hired by a Catholic grade school that was struggling to survive financially. And at the very first board meeting, Mother Superior came to my friend and said, I want you to know that we hired you against my better judgment. Until now, we have always trusted God that he will take care of us. And my friend replied, he is taking care of you. He sent me to you. Okay. And she was quiet for a moment, and she said, I think I'm going to like you. Okay? Okay. Now, this tension runs throughout the history of Catholic religious orders. There are certain Catholic institutes which like to emphasize the idea of trust in divine providence, and we're going to give glory to God by showing how much God's going to take care of us. And then there are other Catholic institutes which say, yes, we're going to trust in God, but we're also going to engage in the ordinary, legitimate human ways of getting a job done. So, for example, the Theatines, which were founded only about 10 years before the Jesuits, their official name is Clerks Regular of the Divine Providence. They really wanted to emphasize the idea of trusting in God alone, and so they refused to do any vocation promotion. They said, we're simply going to do our jobs as priests and trust that God is going to send us people. Right? And they said, we are not going to go out and try to recruit benefactors. We are going to trust God that he is going to spontaneously bring us benefactors. Okay. Now, this is a perfectly legitimate spirituality. There is absolutely nothing wrong with this spirituality, and great miracles and great holiness have been demonstrated by saints and religious orders who practice this spirituality. But Ignatius was very, very clear. This is not the spirituality of the Society of Jesus. What made Ignatius so distinctive and so radical for his time is that he said, yes, we are going to trust God. Ultimately, everything depends on God's grace, no question about it. But we are going to employ every human means to get the job done. So Ignatius told Jesuits, yes, trust that God is going to send us vocations, but I want you to go out there and do vocation promotion. I want you to go out there and recruit guys. Ignatius said, yes, pray to God that he send us benefactors, but I also want you to go out there and try to recruit benefactors. All right? The Theatines refused to write written constitutions because they said, we are going to rely on God alone to make sure that we remain organized and uniform and on the right path. To write constitutions is a sign of a lack of faith. Ignatius writes, the very first paragraph he writes in the constitutions is, yes, ultimately we depend on God's grace for everything, but we're also going to write constitutions, all right? This human way of getting things done. And this is very, very essential to Ignatius' spirituality, all right? This is really what made the Society of Jesus so controversial from the beginning. So, this is the beginning of part 10. So you remember Father Sosa said at the beginning of his talk, Ignatius begins by saying, in God alone must be placed the hope that he will preserve and carry forward the Society of Jesus and its mission. But then 2 paragraphs later, he says, when based upon this foundation, the natural means that equipped the human instrument of God our Lord to interact with his fellow human beings, by natural means, he means things like taking someone to the doctor or writing constitutions. The natural means that equip the human instrument of God our Lord to interact with his fellow human beings will foster universally the preservation and growth of this whole body. For God desires to be glorified both through the natural means, which he gives as creator, and through the supernatural means, which he gives as author of grace. Okay? Therefore, the human or acquired means should be sought with diligence. As you know, for the greater glory of God is the motto of the Society of Jesus. Ignatius wanted Jesuits to maximize the glory that they gave to God as much as they could. And so it stands to reason then that if there's 2 ways that we can glorify God, pray to God that he heal my child, but I also glorify God by taking my child to the doctor, then Ignatius is going to say, I want you to do both. I want you to do both. Right? Now, this is at the very beginning of what he says in part 10. That's not the first time he says it. Ignatius makes that very same point in dozens of ways throughout the entire book of the Constitutions, starting with, this is the very first paragraph of the entire book. Although God, our Creator and Lord, is the one who in his supreme wisdom and goodness must preserve, direct, and carry forward in his divine service this least society of Jesus. So we're all agreeing that everything ultimately depends on God's grace. Nevertheless, since the gentle disposition of divine providence requires cooperation from his creatures, we think it necessary that constitutions be written to aid us to proceed better. Okay, to aid us to proceed better. So the written constitutions in themselves are emblematic of what Ignatius' spirituality is all about. Then, in part 10, he lists 10 human things that really any human beings would do if they're trying to keep an organization together, right? 10 human things that he wants Jesuits to be doing to promote, to preserve and increase the society. Number 1, he says, I want Jesuits to embrace schools and embrace education, among other reasons, because it's going to cultivate vocations to the Society of Jesus, right? John O'Malley was very clear. The early reason why the Society of Jesus grew so fast was because our ministry of the schools, right? These young men who meet Jesuits in the schools. So Ignatius was very, very concerned about vocation promotion, about numbers, about the size of the society. Avoid all appearance of avarice. Avoid all appearance of ambition. Be selective about whom they admit. Ignatius did not want the Jesuits to accept everybody willy-nilly. He did want us to be, cautious. Elect superiors general according to the instructions in Part 9. Make efforts to stay in touch and to keep each other informed. Be neither too lax nor too austere in their asceticism and labors. Win the favor of all and avoid the appearance of partiality. Be discreet in the use of privileges granted by the Apostolic See, and observe the constitutions and read them regularly. So depend on God's grace, but also do these things, all right? And that's Part 10. That's the whole of Part 10 right there. Now, to give you a concrete example of what this looked like historically, while Ignatius was still alive, he's the superior general of the society, there was a Dominican theologian named Melchior Cano who absolutely hated Ignatius and hated the Jesuits. He thought we were the Antichrist and the worst thing to happen to the church, right? See, this stuff goes all the way back to the beginning, right? And from the pulpit, Melchior Cano is telling the faithful that the Jesuits are the Antichrist. Ignatius tells the rector of the community where Melchior was, I want you to sue Melchior Cano in court for slander. You sue him. The Jesuit wrote back and said, Father General, with all due respect, shouldn't we simply trust God? Isn't it a little unseemly to sue somebody for slander? Let's just focus on our work, making sure that we're doing our work faithfully and well. Let's trust that God is going to protect us, and then let it go. And Ignatius responded, yes, trust that God will protect us. Yes, remain focused on your work. And yes, sue the pants off Melchior Cano, all right? And then he actually, through Polanco, gives that rationale that I just gave you, where Ignatius says we are employing a legitimate human means. There's nothing immoral, there's nothing unethical about suing somebody for slander, right? Therefore, we are going to use this legitimate human means to get the job done. Now, if that's the content of Part 10, what I want to stress here is that everything that was just mentioned has already been said 3, 4, 5 times, if not more, earlier in the book. Everything in Part 10 is a repetition of things that Ignatius has said many times before. Okay. Now, notice this format of the book, the 10 parts. Notice how it seems to be focused on the individual Jesuit. Part 1, how do we admit individuals? Part 2, how do we dismiss individuals? Part 3, spiritual formation of individuals. Part 4, intellectual formation of individuals. Part 5, the vows we give to them. Part 6, how they behave in public and in Jesuit community, their personal comportment. Part 7, how we discern missions for Jesuits, individual Jesuits. And then Part 8, how we cultivate a union and mind of minds and hearts among individual Jesuits. And then Part 9, the Superior General. And in Part 9, Ignatius provides a portrait of the ideal Superior General, what the ideal general should look like, which for 500 years, Jesuits have understood that this is ideally what every Jesuit should look like, the ideal Father General, right? And so notice how the entire book seems to be about the individual, the formation of the individual, right? And so there are many writers who will say, well, that's essentially what the constitutions are about. But then there's a problem. Logically speaking, then, the book should seem to end with Part 9. If it's really about the individual, why does the book continue with Part 10? And not only continue, all it is a repetition of things that Ignatius has said before. It doesn't seem to make any sense. Right? And when you read what commentators say about Part 10, it's clear that many of them aren't quite sure what to do with it. Right? Some of them just kind of dismiss Part 10 as saying, oh, well, Ignatius is simply repeating major points that he wants Jesuits to remember. Okay? But what others say, what many others say is, if Part 9 would be the logical conclusion of the book, but then Part 10 just kind of mysteriously throws the book open again, well, that must mean that Part 10 is a symbol of the fact that Ignatius did not want to bring the constitutions to a close, that he wanted them to be open, ever adaptable, ever changeable for the needs of the future. So in other words, writers are saying, clearly Ignatius, in a symbolic kind of way, is saying that the constitutions are not set in stone, but can be ever revised, okay? So just to give you a few examples here. Thomas Clancy was an American Jesuit and an early commentator on the constitutions. And what he wrote is, what Ignatius wants to ensure, above all in the constitutions, is the proper formation of Jesuits. Right? Again, the individual Jesuits, how they're formed. He's saying that's the essence of the book. After that, he feels that they can be trusted to discern the will of the Lord without too many directives from above. You won't need to rely on superiors as much if you are thoroughly trained in discernment. Okay? And then we go to a Belgian Jesuit, André de Geger, and what he wrote, notice the similarities, Ignatius did not really lock up the constitutions or bring them to a rigid conclusion. Rather, he left them open to new life in the future. By virtue of its apostolic purpose, the society needs to come out of itself for its own preservation and growth. Notice that. Come out of itself. What does that mean? Right? It must ever remain boldly open to the future if it is to accomplish its missions. This is essential to its vitality and progress. That is why the constitutions finish with Part 10, which directs our attention toward the future. So notice how he's interpreting Part 10 then as leaving the book open, just like Father Clancy did. And Father Kolfenbach says very much the same thing. Ignatius never wished to consider the constitutions definitively ended. He did not wish to leave us a cut and dried system, a spirituality that was closed in on itself. Notice again that phrase. And it sounds like what they're saying is, if the Society of Jesus is preoccupied with its own well-being, its own survival, its own growth, that is something unhealthy. That the healthy thing to do is to keep focused on the future, on the mission, that which is outside of us, and then just trust that God is going to take care of us. In every sense, since he conceived the constitutions as a way toward God, Ignatius was unable to consider them as forever set and determined. Okay. Now, what I would argue is this. I would respectfully disagree with those three Jesuits. I think this is a very big misunderstanding of what Ignatius is trying to do. Okay? The formation of the individual is not the ultimate goal of the constitutions. Ignatius made that explicitly clear in the constitutions. The formation of the individual Jesuit is not an end in itself. It is a means to an end, namely the creation of a unified body of men that is thoroughly, from start to finish, from head to toe, configured in such a way that it serves the greater glory of God. It is all about the creation of a unified body. That is why Ignatius says in the constitutions, while the consideration that comes first and has more weight in the order of our intention regards the universal body of the society, He's saying, that's what I'm trying to get. That's the point. That's the end zone I'm trying to put the football in, right? Of which the union, good government, and preservation and well-being are primarily in view. So he's saying these are the primary goals of the exercise of the constitutions: the union, the good government, and the preservation of the society. Nevertheless, inasmuch as this body is made up of members, and what occurs first in the order of execution pertains to the individual members, it is here that we shall begin. Okay. Is this kind of making sense? All right? Now, you might think that I'm splitting hairs here, but in reality, this has a lot of profound implications, right? Which I'm going to try to unpack a little bit here. This is the title of Part 10, how the whole body of the society is to be preserved and increased in its well-being. So remember when I said everything in Part 10 is a repetition of what came earlier. When Ignatius is saying it earlier, it refers to individual Jesuits. But now he's making the very same points with reference to the society as a unified body. That's why even though he's repeating himself, it really has a very different meaning. Right? Polanco says this explicitly. I'll show you in a minute. Right. Notice that this is from the deliberations of 1539, when the Jesuits, the 10 companions, decided to form the Society of Jesus. By the end, we decided that we ought not to split apart what God has gathered and united. On the contrary, we ought day by day to strengthen and stabilize our union, rendering ourselves one body with special concern for each other in order to effect the greater spiritual good of our fellow men. For united spiritual strength is more robust and braver in any arduous enterprise than it would be if segmented. What Ignatius, or we think Ignatius wrote that. We don't know for sure, but we think Ignatius wrote it. What Ignatius meant was the individual Jesuits, those 10 men who formed the Society of Jesus, as individuals, if each one wanted to serve God, the greater glory of God, as much as possible during his lifetime, let's say, for example, that each individual companion can save 100 souls over the course of his lifetime, then by coming together in a unified body with a collective vision, with a superior, with a more universal view, a broader view of what's going on than any one person could have, that same individual might be able to save 1,000 souls. So the Society of Jesus as a unified body, precisely as a unified body, will make a far bigger impact on the world than if all of its men were operating independently of each other, even if they had the same goals, all right? Even if they had the same goals. Now, this is where my favorite talking point comes in. Edgar Allan Poe, one of my favorite writers, he is traditionally credited with inventing the short story format. Okay? And he used to play cards with the Jesuits at Fordham University. And he later wrote to a friend, "You have to love the Jesuits. They drink, they smoke, they play cards, and they never talk about religion," right? But what Poe said was, if you want to write a really effective short story, you need to know exactly how you want your story to end. You need to know exactly what the final sentence is going to be, and you need to know exactly what impact you want it to have on your reader. And then, once you've identified that, you write the story backwards, so to speak, so that every single thing in the story, the characters you create, their dialogue, their actions, the environment, everything is pointed toward that one end. Not a single sentence of the story should be wasted. That's what Poe said. Ignatius would have loved Poe, because that is exactly what Ignatius is thinking when he's writing the Jesuit constitutions. He knows that he wants to make the biggest impact that he can, called the more universal good, the greater glory of God, the biggest impact that he can on the church, right? And if we're seriously interested in maximizing that impact, then every single thing that Jesuits do from start to finish, the way that we select men, the way that we dismiss men, the kind of studies that we give them, all these different things must be decided with that end in view, and for no other reason than that end in view. That is why, in that sense, the Society of Jesus, it's not simply that we share a common vision or even a common leader, but that every aspect of the Jesuit way of proceeding is configured toward that goal. And for that reason, Ignatius believed that the Society of Jesus is special. He believed that there is no other institute in the church, no other organization that was as thoroughly configured to the greater glory of God as was the Society of Jesus, right? And to give you one little example of what I mean, when Ignatius was alive, the church was desperately in need of good bishops, right? Well, when is the church never in need of good bishops? And so the Society of Jesus was the natural place for popes to go looking whenever they needed good men to be bishops. Okay, we have these highly educated men here. We have these highly virtuous men here. So I'm just going to take them and make them bishops. And Ignatius went to Pope Paul III and said, Holy Father, I understand your need for good bishops. I really do. But can you pinky swear, all right? Can you promise to me that you will not choose any of my men unless you absolutely have to? Because Ignatius said this, Holy Father, if you cherry pick my best men every time you need a bishop, which will be always, I'm going to be left with a bunch of mediocre men, right? And what is more, once word gets out that the fastest way to be a bishop is to be a Jesuit, then I'm going to have all these men joining the Jesuits for completely the wrong reason. And so Ignatius believed it was far more in the interests of the church, the best interests of the church, that the Society of Jesus remained a unified body of men at the service of the church, and that we would make a bigger impact doing that than if we send all these men off to be bishops. That's a pretty bold statement, don't you think? That's pretty bold. But it gives you a sense of how strongly Ignatius believed in that unity, that collective body. This is what Ignatius wrote to the Jesuits in Coimbra, Portugal. While all institutes of Christian life, he means like the Benedictines, the Franciscans, the Carmelites, are directed to these ends, meaning the glory of God, you have been called by God to this one, where not with a mere general intent, but with an investment therein of your whole life and all its activities, everything's configured toward this one goal, you are to make yourselves a continual sacrifice to the glory of God and the salvation of the neighbor, towards which you are to cooperate not just by your example and earnest prayers, things like, like the Theatines, for example, their example and their earnest prayers as they're praying inside their community, but also by the other outward means ordained by his divine providence for our helping each other. From this you can realize what a noble and royal way of life you have taken up, For not only among human beings, but even among angels, there is no nobler activity than that of glorifying their Creator and breaking, ooh, that was a typo. It's supposed to be bringing his creatures back to him to the extent of their capacity. Right? I ask my students, I said, if you knew that you could save one soul over the course of your lifetime, just one soul, bring one soul to God to live forever with God, would that be enough? All your suffering, all your sacrifices, everything you do, would the knowledge that you saved one soul be enough? And I'm willing to bet that every single one of you here would say yes. So imagine then, if we dedicate ourselves to saving as many souls as possible. Ignatius is saying there is no nobler, there is no more meaningful thing that any human being can do than to dedicate his or her life to that mission. Okay? Now, do you remember when I told you that Polanco was a pack rat and he saved all his notes when he's drafting the constitutions? Well, as a matter of fact, he has a little note about why they have Part 10 in the constitutions. Everything that was said in Part 3 about the conservation of those individuals who are admitted, how do we make sure that these young men persevere in their vocation and thrive, applies equally in Part 10 to the conservation of the society as a whole that is composed of those members, all right? So Polanco is aware that this material is repetitive, but he's making a point by doing it. Now we're talking about the society as a whole. But this much may be added. Those belonging to this society must be patient in their labors and adversities and contradictions, so that they not be disturbed or lose heart when they come. And it is this exercise of patience that is the purpose of Part 10. What this means, by patience in our Catholic tradition, we mean enduring the sufferings and setbacks of life with good humor and tranquility, not getting angry, not getting vengeful. Okay. What Polanco is saying is that, you remember in the exercises, men and women are invited to ask for the third degree of humility. We are invited to ask Christ to suffer along with him, provided it's for his greater glory and honor. What Polanco is saying is, if you join this body, you're going to get that in a way that you wouldn't otherwise. By virtue of belonging to this body of men, you are going to have more opportunities to practice patience, because the society of Jesus as a whole is going to be under attack. And as you all know, the Society of Jesus for the last 500 years has been one of the most controversial and vilified organizations in history, right? So, how am I doing, Patrick?
20 minutes.
20 minutes, okay. I believe, I can't prove it, I have no documentary evidence for this, but I'm certain that after Ignatius's vision at Listorta, he understood that the society was going to be attacked more than any other religious organization that had come before. Certainly history has panned out that way, right? Certainly history has panned out that way. And I do believe that this is what Polanco is referring to here. That, well, okay, don't mean to belabor the point, but you understand. Now, what I'd like to do now is address some common myths about the constitutions. Once we understand what Part 10 is about, and the book as a whole is headed toward, it really starts to unravel a lot of myths that we tell about the society, about the constitutions. Okay? So, a myth that has been around for the last 60 years or 70 years is that Ignatius and the first companions never wanted written constitutions in the first place. That originally they had hoped to be just a unified, charismatic body of men led directly by God. Okay. Nothing could be further from the truth. Nothing could be further from the truth. Immediately after the deliberations of 1539, when they write the first draft of the formula of the Institute, which is called the 5 chapters, they explicitly say that written constitutions are essential and necessary for the end that they seek. Okay? The end that they seek. It is not enough for the Society of Jesus to be simply companions in the Lord, led by the Holy Spirit, as beautiful as that is. If we are going to serve the greater glory of God, if we are going to maximize our impact on the church and the world, it is critical that we all behave in the same way, that we all operate according to the same policies. And that is precisely why written constitutions are so important for Ignatius. Okay. Another thing that you will often see Jesuit writers say is that Ignatius wanted every Jesuit to be so skilled in discernment that he could decide on his own how he wants to follow the rules, how he wants to follow the constitutions. Numerous writers say this kind of thing, okay? Well, first of all, Ignatius never said anything like that, all right? Never said anything like that. In fact, in the constitutions, Ignatius says 8 times, only superiors have the authority to adapt the constitutions for the circumstances. Every other Jesuit is supposed to follow the constitutions very closely. Ignatius said that, in accordance with what their superiors decide. Because, again, it goes back to the same thing. I don't need to join the Society of Jesus in order to be able to follow my own discretion, right? The whole point of joining this body of men is to belong to a collective vision, a collective way of operating. And that is why the vow of obedience was the most important vow for Ignatius. That vow of obedience is the point that we are responding to a superior general and local superiors who have a much broader vision than we do, right? And that we're operating as that collective body. Okay. One thing that you will hear Jesuits say all the time is that Ignatius deliberately left the constitutions unfinished at the time of his death in order to convey to Jesuits that they should consider the society to be always in process, always open to change in light of new experiences. Okay? Well, yes, we should be always open to change. I don't think anybody's questioning that. But let's be clear. Ignatius never said that. Never said anything like that. And yet this gets repeated over and over and over again. It's a cliche that we've been saying for the last 6 or 7 decades. And again, my point being, the constitutions is about the preservation and increase of the Society of Jesus as an organized body. It's not about the mission per se. This is very, and the commentator in Ireland, Brian O'Leary makes this point very well. He's a Jesuit commentator on the constitutions in Ireland. He makes this point very clearly. We often say something like, the constitutions are at the service of the church. No. The Society of Jesus is at the service of the church. The constitutions are at the service of the Society of Jesus. It's all about how we preserve and grow as that unified body of men dedicated to the greater glory of God. And in that sense, that is the end of the story. There is a conclusion in one sense, that that's the ultimate goal that we're striving for in the book. And then finally, something that many Jesuits will say over and over again, is that the constitutions is not inward-looking, but outward-looking. Again, remember, going back to that idea, there are people who will say, if you're preoccupied with vocation promotion, it's because you're not facing the future boldly, But Ignatius is going to say, and does say explicitly, that what he says in the Constitutions, it's about the preservation and increase of the society of Jesus. The whole book, by its nature, in that sense, is inward looking. It's about the society of Jesus and how we thrive and about how we grow. And so for Ignatius, if this body truly is totally configured to the greater glory of God like nothing else, then the more that the society grows, the more glory is going to be given to God. All right? In that sense, there's no distinction between the preservation and increase of the society, that inward looking, and the focus on the mission. Those are two sides of the same coin. Two sides of the same coin. Okay? So, to prove this, I always like to say, Jesuits, we need to spend more time listening to our critics, because our critics very often see something about us that we don't see because we're too close to it, right? And one of the biggest critics of the Jesuits in the early 1900s was an ex-Jesuit. His name was Miguel Mir. He left the Society of Jesus and then wrote all these nasty diatribes about the Jesuits. But he said something which was absolutely true, all right? He put his finger on what I've just been talking about. And what Mir wrote was, what is negative is not that the society seeks the greater glory of God, but that it associates this greater glory with the greater good of the society, with the result that this union or identification is inseparable. A union such as this can only be striking to anyone who reads the Constitutions. He's absolutely right. He's absolutely right. It is certain that in the rules of the other religious orders, there is no hint of such a union or identification between the glory of God, the greater glory of God, and the greater good of the Institute. Okay? So that's about as bold as it gets, right? It's about as bold as it gets. But you've heard the old joke, you're not being paranoid if they really are out to get you, right? In the same way, Ignatius would say, you're not being arrogant if you really are unique, if you really are special, right? Ignatius is simply saying, from his point of view, he's speaking the truth, right? That this is what makes the Society of Jesus special. So I'll end with this quote from Nadal. The society is founded on this principle of seeking in all things the greater service of God, the key word being greater. And this is what all in the society aspire to and must aspire to, which is the highest end that can possibly exist. Okay? All right, I hope that made sense. Thoughts or reactions or questions? If we have a little extra time, I will do a little soft shoe if you like. So.
Thank you very much, Bart. There is two microphones, and so please just raise your hand if you have any questions. So the microphone is for Nick Austin.
Thank you very much, Bart. It would be great to be one of the students in your class. So I'm not disagreeing with anything. I was just thinking about this, perhaps this spirituality of cooperation, which you're drawing attention to in Ignatius, that in part 10, at first sight, it looks a little bit more of the Theatine spirituality. Place all of your hope in God. So it can only tie up with the following paragraphs if you're hoping that your cooperation is given by God. So it's even your own efforts, the human means that you're using, that God gives you the grace to use those for his greater glory. So I think that's just complementing what you said, but that in his spirituality of cooperation, otherwise it could be a little bit Pelagian, right?
Right.
I trust God and I use all human means, but actually even the use of human means, God is working through you're relying on God to sustain your cooperation, put it that way.
That's absolutely right. No question that Ignatius would agree 100% that ultimately everything is God's grace in the great mystery of things. That's right. So you might say it's a question of how much we want to consciously put some kind of reliance on human means in that sense to complement.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. I have a question which is not really very spiritual. It may seem philosophical. Is this dialectic between the spirit and body, the preservation and the conservation, not only of the body, but also of the spirit? I want to know if Ignatius is intending to separate the body and the spirit. The body of the society, do you have a body of the society without the spirit? Do you have the spirit of the society without the body? Or do you have the body within the spirit? And so this is a very important point because I would like to connect it to all the growth of the society in terms of number.
That's right.
For instance, if it happens that the society disappears in some part of the country, what we are seeing today, that we don't know, we no longer have Jesuits, for instance, in Italy. It's just an example. So can the spirit stay without the body? I mean, we need the body so that the spirit can also be preserved. What I'm underlining here is the necessity to think about the growth of the physical body of the society. Because without the growth, without the physical body of the society, the spirit of the society will also disappear in a certain way. This is a question of promotion vocation, for instance. And I know in some part of the society, we say we need quality, we don't need a number. But I think we need also the body. And this is not an abstraction, it is a reality. But now, if we consider only the body, which can be also an extreme temptation in some part of the society of Jesus, we have a number of Jesuits, a big number of Jesuits. Mm-hmm. But we may also, because of looking to the number, we may also forget the spirit and have 3,000 Jesuits, but without the deeper spirit of the society. So how do we maintain both? Right. So this is a question. Thank you very much.
That's a fantastic observation. And I would say one thing is this. This is where part 1 and 2 of the constitutions are especially helpful. That all else being equal, Ignatius wanted the Jesuits to be as big as possible, all right? He never wanted a small group of men. He was looking for as large as possible. But that doesn't mean that you just accept men willy-nilly. Ignatius was insistent that we be very selective in the men that we accept, precisely because many of them do not have the spirit that's required for the body. So, for example, it was very common in the Middle Ages for men and women to enter religious life contrary to their own desires. Okay. Sometimes their parents forced them into religious life. Sometimes they were evading their debtors. Okay. All kinds. Sometimes they were afraid of living on their own and they wanted someone to support them. So there's all these unsavory reasons why people would enter. And Ignatius is very conscious about trying to select only those who really understand what the Spirit is about. So, yes, I think you're absolutely right.
Yes, Tim.
Thanks, Bart. I have a question for you about myths. I think it's John O'Malley who says that the constitutions were obsolete the minute they were finished. And it's been invoked a little bit here in terms of the fact that they don't seem to foresee what becomes one of our most distinctive ministries, that is to say, schools which are principally oriented towards the formation of the laity, right? So is that a myth? That seems to go in the opposite direction from saying they're so open-ended, they're continually dynamic. That actually seems to suggest that they were kind of a dead letter once they were finished. So is that a myth that needs correcting? If we can steelman that myth, and I have a follow-up, but go ahead.
Well, yes, I would not agree with Father O'Malley on that point. I mean, obviously, there are parts of the constitutions that were obsolete even before Ignatius died, all right? Because the schools were not originally on the mindset of the companions when they first founded the Jesuit order in 1540, okay? So professed houses, for example, are something that never really worked in the society's early practice, okay? When you look at part 4 on the intellectual formation of Jesuits and lay students, it's really very clunky because Ignatius and Polanco are constantly adding things to that chapter as their experience dictates, right? And so there's not a lot of internal cohesion with part 4, that kind of a thing. So certainly there are sections of the book that are obsolete and have been almost from the very beginning. But the book as a whole, absolutely not. I mean, I wouldn't have done a new edition if I had thought that, right? So first of all, the raison d'etre of the society, our guiding principles, right? What makes us tick, our priorities, and the way that we make our decisions, all of these things are fundamental to what the constitutions are about. And I would argue they're just as valid today as they were 500 years ago. The book is not a dead letter by any stretch of the imagination. Right? Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying the Constitutions is a sexy read, right? It's not the most exciting book in the world, all right? There are some inspirational passages. But when you look at Ignatius's rationale for why he's choosing what he's choosing, I would argue it's just as valid today as it was then. So.
I thought you might feel that way, so I wanted to give you the chance to say that. The second thing, though, is related. Like, so if we think about this book, we often presume that these texts, as written, just kind of enter into the world and are consumed that way throughout all of time. But for instance, with the constitutions, it's Nadal, of course, promulgating them in 1554 in summary format, right? And it seems, at least as I understand it, that most Jesuits would have known the constitutions principally in the summary for most of the society's history until maybe the 20th century. Can you comment, based on your research in this new edition of the constitutions, a little bit about its life in time? If we have a sense of, like, we're recovering it today, or trying to, I think, as this really important pillar of Jesuit identity and spirituality of the order itself. Mm-hmm. But how true is that in actual history?
Okay, that's a great question. Compared to the constitutions of other religious orders, the Jesuit constitutions is a very large book. And the simple fact of the matter is that very few Jesuits from the beginning ever actually read the whole thing, okay? That, as Tim said, from the very beginning, what the Jesuits did was produce a smaller book in which they take kind of what they thought were the highlights of the book that every Jesuit should know, right? And then give that to every Jesuit so he could carry that around in his pocket. So a little abbreviated version of the constitutions. Now, it was Ignatius himself who actually recommended that the society do that. There are some who will say, oh, that was contrary to Ignatius's intention. No, it wasn't. No, Ignatius, Bobadilla complained that the constitutions were too long, right? But Ignatius says in the constitutions that he wants a summary made of the constitutions, right? I would argue, though, that probably today, for the first time in Jesuit history in 500 years, we're really coming to an appreciation of the significance of the book as a whole. So.
Thank you very much.